All right. So did anybody realize that the notes were on Blackboard and they could print them out? Yay, one person looked. Two people. Exciting. Yes, so all the lecture notes are on Blackboard. They'll be posted early. You can print them, you can keep them on your computer, whatever, but they are available to you. Just because I think it makes it easier. I want you to listen to me when you're in here. You not sit around. Right. But let's talk about an introduction to epidemiology. We're going to talk about a little bit about the history of epi. We're going to talk about the intersection between epi and health services research. And then we're going to do a fun little activity for the end of class. So, what is epidemiology? Actually, before we do this, who has an idea of what epidemiology is? When you walked in this door, did anybody have an idea of what? Can you define epidemiology for me?
I mean, it kind of goes over like the distribution and determinants of like diseases and just kind of like tracking various diseases. And I mean, it works closely with biostats too.
Yes, somebody memorized their book. Good job.
I had Epi 500 already.
Oh, you have?
Yeah. Well,
this is going to be a huge and boring review for you. Excellent. Yes, so the big thing about epi, which you pointed to, is that it's about the distribution and determinants of disease in populations. This is the key. This is the huge difference between talking about epidemiology and talking about just kind of like general medicine. We care in epidemiology about populations. Populations do not necessarily operate the same way that individuals do, but we care about the distribution of disease in populations and what causes disease in populations. Now this does translate back to individuals, but epidemiology equals populations. That's something you can remember. So we're really talking about describing and interpreting patterns when we're talking about epidemiology. We look at patterns of disease, and then we want to figure out why those patterns are operating in the way that they are. Why do certain race ethnicities have a higher likelihood of heart disease than others? Why is a certain geographic region more likely to have colon cancer? So do you know that colon cancer is more common in northern states than in southern states? Anybody know that? It is. Why? Because of vitamin D, supposedly. We'll talk about causal associations later. But the hypothesis is that people in the northern states don't go outside as much. Therefore, they don't get as much vitamin D exposure, and vitamin D is protective against colon cancer. So people in the southern states get more skin cancer, but less colon cancer. Go figure. Let's see. So epidemiology can really be broken up into descriptive epi and analytic epi. Now, all of it's epi, but they have two kind of different focuses. Descriptive epi is really when we're talking about literally describing what's going on, what we see when we're talking about the disease distribution. Who's getting sick? Where are they getting sick? When are they getting sick? That's descriptive. Analytic epidemiology is really talking about relations. What are risk factors for particular diseases? Is risk factor A correlated with disease X? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about analytic. We're talking about actually making comparisons. We're talking about actually looking at correlations in the data. Whereas descriptive, we're really just saying this many people are sick in this particular place at this particular time. Now, what's the purpose of all this information? We use all this information because eventually we want to plan and evaluate strategies for improving the health in populations, right? So we use epidemiologic methods in order to get to a place where we can intervene and hopefully improve population health. So let's talk a little more about what is epidemiology. So it can be viewed both as a field of research that we use to advance scientific knowledge and understanding. It can also be viewed as an application of knowledge to solve public health problems. So epi in and of itself is multidisciplinary. So we use a multidisciplinary approach in epidemiology to really look to approach both research and public health problem solving. Regardless of whether you're talking about it specifically in a research capacity or specifically in an applied setting where we're going out and trying to actually influence population health, we're always concerned with the distribution of disease in populations. That part never changes. So no matter what your focus of a study is, you're really always ending up in the same place. You want to talk about the distribution of disease in populations. which leads me to what is a population? So, if I asked any of you to define what population meant, it's a word that everybody knows, right? But what does it mean to be a population?
Group of people within a geographic area.
It could be a group of people within a geographic area, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. A population literally is however you decide to define it. A population literally is the group of people you are interested in. The group of people that you want, if you're doing a study, the group of people you want to generalize your study back to. So you can define your population based on geographic boundaries. So we could be interested in the population within Missouri, right? Or the population within this classroom. This classroom could be a population. We could be interested in the population of all female employees at SLE. We could be interested, well, that's not a geographic boundary. Geographic boundary, Missouri, all people within the United States, all people within North America, all people in Texas, like all people in East Texas, all of these things. We can define a population based on geographic boundary. We can also define the population based on demographic characteristics. So, all women within the United States, all women in Missouri, all pregnant women in Missouri. It depends on the goal of our study. So our research question is going to really have to do with the population that we're interested in. We can also talk about populations defined by organizational units. So this is when we start talking about health services research. So we might, a lot of times, and we're interested in looking at a population within a particular health organization. So it could be all of the nurses within the SSM system. Or we could be talking about the patient population of Barnes Jewish Hospital. So population in and of itself, the word population doesn't have a defined set of people that it applies to. It applies to who you define it to. You're in charge of defining your population. Now, the big thing with epidemiology where we get really excited is when we talk about subpopulations. So, subpopulation is literally like a little piece of your overall large population. So if you're interested in all people in Missouri, and you want to know the distribution of colon cancer of all people in Missouri, that's great. You find out how many people in Missouri have colon cancer. Right? But then you might want to break it down and say how many women in Missouri have colon cancer and how many men in Missouri have colon cancer. So our larger population would be residents of Missouri, and our two subpopulations would be women and men. Right? We get excited in epidemiology because when you talk about subpopulations, you really get to talk about the differences between groups, and that's where you find where you can intervene. So if you find out that women are more likely to have a certain disease than men, maybe you don't want to spend your limited healthcare dollars on trying to keep men from getting that disease when so many more women do. Right? And we use subpopulations so we can determine where we're going to really spend our money, who we can help. All right, so what do we use epidemiology? What are its functions? Milton Terrace recognized 4 main functions of epi. So we want to discover the agent. We want to discover the cause. We want to know what causes people to get sick, the agent. We want to know, we can also discover the host. If we're talking about infectious diseases, we'll talk about the host and environmental factors. We'll talk about environmental factors in chronic diseases too. So we want to discover what's making people sick. We want to discover other factors that influence health. This particular area of epidemiology we use to provide the scientific basis for the prevention of disease and injury and for the promotion of health. We also use epi to determine the relative importance of causes of illness and disability. So if we determine the importance, we determine that a whole bunch more people are getting sick from disease A than disease B. We can use that information to establish our priorities, both for research and for health promotion and prevention activities, right? We use it to identify sections of the population that have the greatest risk from a specific cause of illness. And then we evaluate the effectiveness of our programs. So if we put into place a preventive program, or if we put into place a therapeutic program, we can use epidemiologic methods to evaluate those. So data generated with epidemiology, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Could you describe what determine meant again?
So really, determines really just means to find out why, to find out the cause. So I went off on a little tangent about infectious disease, the agent-host environment triangle. Ignore that. We'll get to it later. Sometimes my brain gets ahead of me. The determine, we're really just trying to find out why. That's what determine means. Any other questions? All right. So data generated with EPI methods we use for decision making most of the time, right? So here are areas of decision making in health services that we can use epidemiologic methods to influence. We may use them to assess the efficacy or effectiveness of treatment. Who wants to tell me the difference between efficacy and effectiveness? Anyone have a guess? Anyone have an idea? Yeah.
Isn't efficacy like intent related? It's like if it's designed like versus I know in theater efficacy refers to like whether it's designed to have bring out an effect versus if it's just for entertainment. So I was wondering if it's similar.
I'm not familiar with your analogy, so I'm not 100% sure. Efficacy means does it work under perfect conditions? So when we design clinical trials and we limit the people that can be in your clinical trial to a very specific group of people that have no other illnesses except for the one that we're interested in, that's efficacy. When you, at the same they're supposed to, and everything works perfectly. And if you find out that a treatment works under perfect conditions, you can say that it's efficacious.
Effectiveness doesn't means does it work in the real world where everything is messy? Where you know people don't take their pills on time, or people forget to take them 3 days in a row, or where you know those types of things happen, or people have 10 different illnesses all at the same time. They don't just have the one that you were intending to treat. Efficacy, perfect world, does it work? Effectiveness, does it work in the real world in the messy situations? We also use EPI to assess compliance and adherence to treatment regimens. So are people taking their medicine as intended? That's an important question to ask, right? We look at it to, where did I lost my place. Quality assurance, we use EPI methods for quality assurance. And for program planning, we've talked about that, or I have talked about that a couple of times, about how we can use our understanding of the distribution of disease to decide where we're going to put programs and how we're going to implement those programs. We can use it for community monitoring. So, you know, there's vital statistics that the government collects. There's reportable illnesses that anytime anybody comes up with, anytime anyone, well, HIV is the first one that comes to mind. So anytime anybody tests positive for HIV, that's a reportable disease. It goes into a little government database, and you know how many people, you can track how many people have HIV at any given time, and when they developed it, or when they were, at least, not when they developed it, but when they were diagnosed with it. So we use monitoring, we use it for evaluation of therapeutic regimens or programs that we've implemented, and we can use it for community diagnosis. So looking at, is a particular community more or less likely to develop certain diseases. So characteristics of epidemiology. Most epidemiologic work is observational. Who wants to take a stab at what observational means? Anyone?
This neighborhood was healthy at this date, and then over time, I saw that people developed.
So I saw, I saw is the important word in that sentence. Observational means that it's something that we observe naturally that's occurring in the real world. We did not manipulate, as investigators, we didn't manipulate anything. We're not conducting a research experiment We have in no way applied an intervention. Most epidemiologic work is observational. We take naturally occurring groups and we look to see what happened to those two groups in natural circumstances. That is not all epidemiology, but the majority of it counts as observational studies. Most of the time, our epidemiologic studies focus on geographic or demographically defined populations. Again, not all the time, but in general this happens. This is opposed to studying a small defined group in a clinical setting, right? So epidemiologists do sometimes run clinical trials, but we're very rarely involved in it's not pure epidemiology to go into one of those little treatment centers where they lock people in a room and pay them $5,000 to sit there and take drugs for 24 hours or something. You know what I'm talking about? Have you seen those commercials for the research center that do those? I had a friend that did those. In order to like buy this really expensive dog, this dog costs like $1,500, and he put himself through like 3 weeks of medical trials so that he could buy a dog. It seems a little insane to me, but you know, that's what people do. We'll talk about the ethics of those situations later. And then finally, I've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. Epidemiology is typically multidisciplinary. Most studies involve people that have clinical insights, so people that have an MD or some other, or PhDs in biology, or people that have some type of clinical insight. It involves statisticians, it involves health policy people. Epidemiology, by its nature, is multidisciplinary. Alright, so let's talk about how we work through epidemiologic reasoning. So let's say we've done our descriptive epidemiology study, and we now understand how a particular disease is distributed in a population, and now we're asking some more intense questions. We're getting into the analytic part. So we've looked at our descriptive study, and we have a suspicion that risk factor X, I'm going to use a big example that everyone understands. So let's say we now suspect that people that smoke are more likely to get lung cancer. Let's take it back 100 years before we realized that that was the case, right? So basically what happened, people kind of noticed, and then they looked at it and said, hey, seems that there's a lot of people that smoke that get lung cancer, right? Maybe we should test this. This is when the progression of epidemiologic reasoning comes in. So we suspect that a risk factor actually causes a disease, or influences the development of a disease. We formulate a specific hypothesis. What's a hypothesis? Anyone want to guess? Probably should have learned it in like 3rd grade. Yeah.
An educated guess.
Yes, exactly. Does anybody remember that from like elementary school science fairs or high school science fairs? Yeah, it's an educated guess. Good job. It is literally a statement of what you think is going to happen based on your knowledge of the situation. So we've kind of seen this pattern of distribution of the risk factor and the distribution of the disease. We decided, hey, I think that smoking causes lung cancer. So this is my hypothesis. Smoking causes lung cancer. Now that's a poorly stated one, but works for the purpose of this little example. So the next step, we then have to design and conduct our study. So we'll learn about all these study designs. This is the next step in epidemiologic reasoning. We want to explore the relationship between the exposure and the disease. We want to look, is there truly a statistical association between the exposure that we're interested in and the outcome that we're interested in? And then finally, you want to judge whether or not this association is causal. So just because two things are related does not mean that one causes the other, right? Who's heard the phrase, correlation does not equal causation? Anyone? Yeah, everyone should have heard that at some point in their lives. Just because something is associated with another thing does not mean that thing one causes thing two. So just because people that drink alcohol are more likely to get lung cancer, this is true, does not mean that drinking alcohol causes lung cancer. Can anybody think of a reason why alcohol might be associated with lung cancer?
You gotta have a cig when you go
That's
back.
exactly right.
Afterwards.
People who drink alcohol are more likely to smoke.
Well, not just that, if you're also like, before kind of smoking bans and stuff, if you're in bars and stuff, so the areas you're more likely to be exposed to secondhand.
Absolutely, yes.
oversimplification of the scenario, but yes, absolutely. So there is a third factor. Anyone want to guess what that's called? You've had it before, so. Yeah.
A lurking variable.
I'm sorry?
A lurking variable.
Lurking variable. I haven't heard that one in a long time. Yeah, in epidemiology, we typically refer to it as a confounding variable. We'll get to that later. But yes. So, the last thing that we do in an epidemiologic study is decide, or an epidemiologic progression. These 4 steps will take many, many, many studies. It's not just one study. It's many, many, many. But then we have to decide whether or not we can conclude that there's a causal association between our risk factor of interest and our outcome of interest. All right, so let's talk about the process of scientific discovery. And this is really taking us back when we learned about the scientific method. When you had your little poster in the science fair, these are the things that you should have been contemplating, even though you were probably like 7, so you weren't really thinking about them. But in science, we really have to acknowledge the fact that we are making assumptions, right? And everything, it's not a true given. We're making certain assumptions when we say that the things that we do that are scientifically valid have meaning to us. The first is that nature is orderly, that things happen because other things happen. The second is that we can know nature, that we actually have the ability to figure out what's going on, that all natural phenomena have natural causes. So it's not because the magical fairy came down and sprinkled dust on you and that's why you got sick, right? That natural phenomena have natural causes. That nothing is self-evident. Now this one's very important. In scientific reasoning, you have to question everything. You cannot say, oh, well, common sense says that's true. Nothing can be counted as self-evident. You have to scientifically test everything. Knowledge is based on experience. We all know this. You have experiences, and therefore that creates your view of the world. And then knowledge is superior to ignorance. So we have to say, if we're gonna really say that this scientific approach is the way to go, we have to be willing to say that we would rather know than not know. So, the scientific method, you start by describing your theory. You then create your testable prediction, your hypothesis. You then create some study designed to test your hypothesis, at which point you then revise your theory. So it's a circular process, you never stop. You always, you're never going to come up with the final answer. There'll always be somewhere else you can go. Alright, so let's talk about a theory. Theory is made up of 4 things. The first is your hypothesis, which is predicting a relationship. So a hypothesis, can't talk anymore, predicts something that ought to be observed in the real world if your theory is true. So if what you hold as true really is true, you can make a hypothetical statement. Sorry. Oh, that's going to come out well on that camera. I'm going to be more cognizant of the fact that you guys can review all of my foibles. But anyway, a hypothesis is a tentative and testable. That's the important word. It's a testable statement about how changes in one thing are expected to influence changes in another. But hypotheses have to be testable, otherwise it's just a guess. Now, the second component is a variable. So variable is a concept. It's an idea that represents something in reality. So we use our hypothesis to predict relationships between variables. Now we can have independent or dependent variables. Independent variables, in epidemiology, we frequently refer to as risk factors. Okay? So I will use these words interchangeably. There is some school of thought that people think you should only use the terms independent and dependent variables when you're talking about truly experimental studies. I do not subscribe to that school of thought, so I will use independent and dependent variables in exchangeably with risk factor and outcome and or disease. So the dependent variable is whatever variable you think the independent variable is influencing. So our independent variable is our risk factor, and our dependent variable is our outcome, or our disease. Did you have a question, or were you just...
Stretching.
Okay. All right. Attributes are the concepts that make up a variable. So regardless of if you're talking about it being an independent variable or a dependent variable, it's a concept, right? And so a concept is literally a mental image that symbolizes an idea or an object or an event or a person. But the concepts, so then there's several concepts that make up your variable. These are called your attributes. So gender could be our variable, and the attributes of gender would be male and female. Occupation could be our variable, and the attributes that make up occupation could be lawyer, physician, student, and so forth. Finally, observations are the building blocks of your theory. These are what you see. This is what actually, or may not be what actually occurs. It's what you think occurs by what you're visualizing, what you see in the real world. You use observations then to help build your theory and verify whether your theory is correct. Alright. So that's the fun history of science concept of theory thing. Let's talk about the history of epi briefly. Alright. Why do we care about this? Basically, you can't really understand where we are now if you don't talk about where we were before. So let's talk a little bit about the history. We'll talk about, this is a timeline they got from Schoenbach and Rosenman. This particular textbook, if you want to go look at it, it's a free text online. You have to sign up for it. But you can actually access this for free should you want to. The references in here, the recommended reading list. But anyway, they provided a really nice timeline to look through. We'll go through a few things. We'll start with, what do we want to start with? Let's start with the periods first. So we can roughly divide the history of epi into kind of like the antiquity period, the classical period, the classical epidemiology period, and then the present, the new epidemiology. So in say early antiquity period, usually from the 5th century BC to around 1830. And then we'll talk about classical epi. That's when people really started to create epi and like focus it as an actual science. From about 1830 to the 1940s. And then the new epidemiology is about 1940, the present. So if we're talking about antiquity, Hippocrates, who I'm sure everybody has heard of, is kind of the first person that developed actually a medical approach to disease. He actually described clinical cases of diseases and linked those diseases to environmental factors. And that's a big step. So instead of just ascribing everything to the whims of the gods, he actually said, hey, there's certain environmental factors that make people more likely to get sick. So he sat down and did that. Let's see, Pierre Charles Alexander Louis utilized comparative methods to evaluate the effects of bloodletting on mortality. So here he's actually saying, we did our bloodletting on these people, and we didn't do it on these people, and more people seem to die with bloodletting. That was a big deal, considering bloodletting was the kind of treatment of choice for most diseases, and then, oh wait, it's kind of killing everybody. So here's the first person to actually sit down and say, let's compare these two groups. So when we get to the 1830s, we're starting to move into the classical epidemiology period. This was around the same time as the Industrial Revolution. What happened with the Industrial Revolution? A whole bunch of people started crowding in one place. And when you have crowds, you breed disease. So this is when infectious disease started to really become a problem. I mean, it had always been a problem before, but then you had these huge clusters of people that were all getting sick with these crowd diseases. So, and this is when the observational epidemiology that we know it today, especially the infectious disease epidemiology, really began to take shape. So who here has heard of John Snow? Anyone? Who was John Snow? I'm sorry? You don't know? I'm going to call on you last because I know you know. John Snow.
I think so. Isn't he the one who discovered like the sewage, like basically going into the things is what's causing cholera?
Absolutely. So there's a huge cholera epidemic in London, and John Snow was the one that was smart enough to say, hey, let's look at the patterns of disease distribution. So he went door to door and said, hey, is anybody in your house, they have cholera? And then he plotted them all on a map. And he noticed that most of the people that had cholera had been getting all of their water from one pump. And that particular pump was right down the street from a place where they were dumping sewage and water. And then all these people up here weren't getting cholera, and that's because they were upriver before the sewage started going into the water. And he said, hey, wait a minute. And this was before germ theory, people. This was before anybody had any idea that germs cause disease. But John Snow plotted the distribution of people that were getting sick and took the pump off the took the handle off the pump. And people stopped getting cholera down there when they had to go around and get their water from the clean source. So that was a big deal. Around the same time, William Farr also started tracking vital statistics. They were both contemporaries in London. And so he started keeping track of who was dying and what they were dying from. That's also a pretty big deal. That was the forerunner of all the vital statistic systems that we have today. And then we move into our more recent years. So what's happened recently? Well, we don't have as many problems with crowded conditions. We've learned a lot about sanitation. Now, not that infectious diseases aren't a problem, but they're not the huge problem. Most people don't die from infectious disease anymore. Most people die from chronic disease now. And so, with that shift from infectious disease to chronic disease within the population, epidemiology has also shifted. And so now there's huge focuses of epidemiology that focus only on chronic illness. And what you do when you're tracking an infectious disease outbreak is a little bit different than what you do if you're trying to look at the distribution of risk factors for colon cancer, right? So epidemiology from 1942 today and throughout the future really is, the vast majority of it is focusing on chronic disease illness, not on infectious disease, though that still is definitely a huge part of it. Right? This is just an example of the breakdown of John Snow and his cholera outbreak. Notice he didn't do number of people, he did number of houses where somebody was sick. So there could have been like 5 people in that house or whatever individually, but he said the number of houses where somebody was sick in the Southwark and Vauxhall Company water supply versus the number of houses
where people were sick from the Lambeth Company versus the rest of London. Or that's the number of houses that exist, I'm sorry, I'm getting my columns mixed up. These are the number of houses in these areas. These are the number of people that were sick. This column right here is the really exciting part. Why do you think that's the exciting one? What did he do in this column?
He made a rate in general, so it's kind of like, it just helps you track it.
Technically this is proportion, not a rate, but it's okay. But he looked, he divided them, right? He said the number of people is sick divided by the number of houses. And then we multiplied by 10,000 houses, so we get a whole number. But then when you start looking at the proportions, now you can make an equal comparison, right? And now you say, oh my gosh, there's a whole lot more, proportionally there's a whole lot more people that are sick there. Let's take the pump handle off, and people won't get sick anymore. And that's what happens. All right. Briefly, so what is health services research? I'm not going to read this to you because I know you know how to read. However, briefly, health services research is literally research into health services. Very obvious, right? So we're talking about what's a health service. Health service is really anything you define it to be, but health service is really just, it can be the organizational structures, it can be hospital systems and delivery of care, it can be the cost of care, it can be health programs that are out in the community. But really, a health service is anything that is designed to either prevent disease, treat disease, or improve the health or quality of life of the population. It's the goal that makes something a health service, really. Now, health outcomes. These are typically the outcomes we're interested in. Mortality, did people die? Morbidity, did people get sick? Or get more sick? Or get another illness? Clinical parameters, so did their blood pressure increase? Did their cholesterol go down? Quality of life or health-related quality of life? You may have lost your foot, but are you still okay with that? Are you still functioning? Don't call that functional status. Functional status, can you still climb stairs? Quality of life, do you care if you can climb stairs? And then organizational and government policies. All of these things are outcomes. An outcome is just the end point that you're interested in. Really? It's what happens. All right. So now we can talk about a little more about epidemiology and health services research and how they intersect. So really we use epidemiology to study the workings of health services research. So epidemiology can really be considered the methodological piece of it, and health services research is just where we're applying that methodology. Fun little model for delivery of health services. So we always start with our population, right? You have to specifically define your population before you can really ask a question about anything, before you can go with your study. So we talked about it earlier, population may be defined based on geographic boundaries, may be defined based on membership in a particular group, or people who utilize a particular health service. We characterize our populations, and then we look at need. So need is simply any perceived problem in health or healthcare services, in this, because that's what we're talking about, right? Health services. So need is just your perceived problem. You can get into the question of perceived by whom, but right now, need is perceived problem. We use perception of need to create our health services, right? So if we think somebody has a need for something, we're probably going to create some service to fulfill that need. And hopefully people utilize that service, and if they utilize that service, then they will get better. But we use epidemiology to evaluate each piece of this puzzle, right? So it creates a loop. So we have our population, we know there's a need, we create a service, they utilize that health service, we look at their health status, did their health status get better? Yes, great, we've created a thing. Is there another need? No, it didn't. Oh, we haven't filled that need, let's find another health service. And last slide, last but not least, we use epidemiology as the method for monitoring our population size, for looking at distributions of health needs within populations, for hopefully identifying causes of health problems and consequences of those problems. We use epidemiologic methods to help us look at the impact of organizational characteristics. So the number of available hospital beds, does that influence the health outcomes of the patient population there? We can use epi methods to look at program quality and performance, so for quality improvement projects. And then for the development and evaluation of public policy. Now frequently it's misused in this capacity, but that's a story for another day. All right, here's the plan. We are going to take 5-10 minute break, and then we will come back and we